Who put the action in the RPG? We'll find out in Metroidvania Works Episode 8. By the mid-80s, the action RPG had been fairly well defined thanks to the Roots games we've explored over the past 7 episodes. It had also shifted its center of innovation from US studios to overseas, as American game companies reeled from the collapse of the Atari market and gravitated toward polar extremes: the simple pleasures of arcade-style gaming or the dense and substantial world of complex personal computer games. The Metroidvania format, which treads a line directly between these two extremes, didn't really have a place in the US market at the time. Thankfully, the British and the Japanese were only too happy to take up the torch with a trio of fantasy adventures that put a new perspective on the format. Developer Ultimate Play the Game's Nightlore is our spotlight feature this episode. We have, of course, seen several works from Ultimate's rebranded version, Rare Limited, in NES Works 1987, Slalom and Wizards and Warriors. I said that Wizards and Warriors felt like Rare playing to their strengths while attempting to recalibrate a familiar game concept to better suit the NES platform and audience, and Nightlore is precisely what I had in mind. Wizards and Warriors was a spiritual successor to Nightlore and its sequels, like Saberwolf, trading an isometric viewpoint for a side-scrolling one, but largely retaining the same general aesthetic and vibe. Just as Wizards and Warriors moved faster and ran more smoothly than just about anything seen before it on NES, Nightlore was a technical showcase for the ZX Spectrum platform. In fact, it was so impressive that Ultimate Play the Game ended up delaying its release for a year or so to prevent it from cannibalizing sales from a couple of less impressive releases they had in the pipeline. The world, they felt, simply wasn't ready for this game. Now please note that I'm working primarily with the Famicom Disk System port of the game here, since I can capture video from that and not from the ZX Spectrum version. They're substantially different works, but you'll still get the idea. Along with Jet Set Willy and Elite, Nightlore belongs to a holy trinity of sorts for British PC games of the early 80s. Its popularity no doubt has a lot to do with its technical prowess, but it's also beloved for the clever ways in which it builds on the principles that would give us the Metroidvania. Let's talk about the technical prowess first, because its impact is quite obvious. Ultimate rendered the game world through an isometric point of view, reminiscent of Atari's Crystal Castles, infusing depth and height into it. Unlike Crystal Castles, Nightlore also retains elements of 2D side-view platformers like Donkey Kong and Jet Set Willy. Namely, protagonist Saberman can and must jump over obstacles in order to complete his quest. At the same time, he can still move around each room of the game's castle on either the X or Y axis. In effect, he can move in 3 dimensions. This does make the game somewhat difficult, as the lack of any shadow casting here leaves a great deal of ambiguity in the physical relationships between objects. This is the eternal bugbear of isometric platformers, even more refined ones from the future, like Landstalker. Eventually, you just kind of have to guess at your jumps, which is of critical importance given the high number of fatal spikes you need to avoid along the way. Still, given the limitations of the Spectrum, these visuals were pretty stunning. They still read well today, in fact. While the graphics drew in players at the time, the gameplay kept them hooked. Nightlore had a lot in common with Atari's Adventure, in that players are dropped into a sprawling realm and asked to retrieve items. In this case, Saberman has to locate more than a dozen mystical artifacts and return them to a cauldron in order to break the curse inflicted on him. This involves a lot of roaming around the castle and backtracking. To keep things interesting, both Saberman's starting location and the placement of objects, which must be retrieved in a mandatory sequence, are semi-randomized each time you play. And to keep things challenging, there's a sort of real-time element to the adventure, as you have only 40 in-game days in which to complete your quest. To keep things weird, Saberman's curse causes him to transform into a wolfman at night. This surprisingly doesn't have any impact on the protagonist's skills or mobility, since you don't gain powers or attack capabilities here, but it does make the world more dangerous. Certain enemies will attack Saberman when he's in wolf form, and this includes the cauldron where you dump your requested MacGuffins. In other words, you don't simply need to learn the lay of the land and how to safely navigate it, you also need to memorize the various semi-random arrangement of key points, while also steering clear of aggressive creatures at night. While there's no character growth here to really push this game into the action RPG format, Nightlore does represent an essential roots influence for the Metroidvania genre. It's heavy on exploration and requires a fair degree of finger dexterity. It's definitely an influential game. Not only did it inspire a generation of British developers, it also made its way to other territories, as seen here with this Famicom Disk System remake by Tosei. It's a challenging game, and often a frustrating one, but it has a clear creative direction and a vast world to explore and master. It leaves no question as to its impact on subsequent adventures. Over in Japan, a year after Dragon Slayer, Nihon Falcom follows up with a second entry in the not really a proper series franchise called Xanadu. While it unquestionably carries forward certain elements of the first Dragon Slayer, it also pushes the game closer to the action RPG style that would become Falcom's trademark. In a lot of ways, Xanadu is the primal font that gives us the likes of Zelda 2, Castlevania 2, and Pop Full Mail. It's clumsier and more opaque than any of those games, which is really saying something, but its combination of role-playing elements with 2D side-scrolling platform action is a first and would be imitated and refined by numerous developers over the years. Xanadu begins by dropping players into a town where they can collect money from the king and gear up at shops before venturing into the dungeon. Everything about this game is sort of counterintuitive, including the simple process of locating the dungeon. Eventually, though, you drop into the dungeon and begin to roam around in search of keys and treasures. Monsters appear here, but you don't take them out with standard sword strikes. Instead, bumping into a foe sends you into combat mode, which eschews the 2D side perspective in favor of a top-down viewpoint. In this mode, you bump into monsters directly to inflict harm upon them. The grab and carry element of Dragon Slayer is absent here, and you don't need to return to your mobile home in order to upgrade your stats. Xanadu uses a more traditional leveling and gear system, reminiscent of Wizardry, where you head back to the surface to trade gold for better armor and weapons. The player's main objective is to conquer more than half a dozen towers scattered throughout the underground realm. The dungeons drop the side view altogether in favor of an extended combat sequence, with each top-down screen linked one by one. Xanadu doesn't lack for big ideas and big ambitions. Whether or not it realizes them successfully is a question for you to decide, but you do have to respect Falcom for really going all in here. Players have to manage a number of stats, most of which are what you'd expect. On top of those, though, you have one called Karma, which is affected by the types of enemies you kill. Slay the wrong foes and your Karma rises, which makes it impossible to level up or acquire the legendary sword needed to defeat the final boss. In other words, it's a punishing, often cruel game. But again, it has no shortage of grand ideas for those who brave its depths. While it's a tough game to revisit in this day and age, it was hugely influential on other action RPGs, as seen almost immediately in the next big Metroidvania, Roots Creation. Yep, right here. Nintendo rarely if ever talks about games that have influenced their own, but The Legend of Zelda for Famicom Disk System and NES appears to have combined a great many concepts seen in previous Metroidvania Works selections through a brilliant synthesis. The definitive action RPG. Well, almost. Zelda doesn't quite fit the pedant's view of what constitutes an RPG because it throws the traditional D&D experience and leveling concepts out the window. In the broad strokes, Zelda plays a lot like Xanadu. Although it doesn't incorporate a side-scrolling action combat view that would arrive in the sequel, the structure of the two games shares a lot in common. Zelda consists of a massive, interconnected overworld containing 9 self-contained dungeons. The whole game plays out through a top-down viewpoint similar to Adventure and Hydlide, and the dungeons are extremely similar to those of Xanadu's, although more intricate and complex. Players can go anywhere from the outset in Zelda. Assuming they can survive long enough to get there, they can even walk immediately to the entrance of the final dungeon. It's very much a sandbox game, with progression gated by a few critical factors. These factors amount to a handful of tools scattered throughout the dungeons. Each dungeon contains at least one treasure the protagonist Link can add to his inventory, most of which are weapons to beef up his combat capabilities, but a handful of treasures are necessary to pass critical points in the game. A ladder allows you to cross gaps, a raft lets you sail across bodies of water, and the 8 fragments of the mystical Triforce allow you to access the final dungeon. Weapons and consumables also help you advance. Bombs allow you to crack open walls, and enemy bait is essential for satiating an otherwise implacable foe. As with every game we've seen to date, Zelda is often downright opaque in its design. Some secrets are hinted at, such as the means to reach the 5th dungeon, while others, like how to reveal level 7, are maddeningly inscrutable. At its best, the in-game dialogue works for the player as a riddle. At its worst, it makes no sense at all. But Zelda is much less frustrating to play than the previous action RPGs we've seen, and this ultimately comes down to the removal of stats. No stats means no compulsory leveling. You can always keep your eyes on your objectives because you don't need to grind out experience points in order to overcome otherwise impossible challenges or increase your survivability. You can only grow in strength by collecting the 3 swords hidden throughout Hyrule, and your defensive power only improves if you buy or find the 2 mystical shield rings. This creates a slick, low-friction gameplay loop. The original Zelda is by no means a breezy game. Your first time through is bound to be a maddening challenge that sends you scrambling for a strategy guide or walkthrough when you find yourself incapable of finding the way forward. Still, while Zelda isn't quite a Metroidvania game, it's getting there. So close. And next time on Metroidvania Works, we finally get to the Metroid and the Vania.